Hi everyone, and welcome to this RYA Scotland recording or video cast, as we're thinking it fits into the category of, on inspections. So what we hope you'll get from this is a wee update that will help you prepare, think about what you might need to have if you are a training centre with your inspection coming up. To help us with this, I've got two people with me today who've got a huge amount of experience in this area. So we have Jane Campbell Morrison and Chris Bradby. I'm wondering if the two of you would like to introduce yourselves. So Jane, do you want to kick us off?
Yep. Hi there. My name is Jane. As Robyn said, I'm a dinghy trainer. I've been a dinghy trainer since the early 1990s and a recently requalified powerboat trainer. And I am currently a freelance trainer delivering sailing and powerboating courses, as well as lots of inspections for the RYA over the last few years.
Thanks, Jane. And over to Chris.
Hello, I'm Chris Bradby. I'm a windsurf trainer and a powerboat trainer, and I have been for about 10 years. And I've been delivering inspections for just over 10 years as well. And my main base is in Edinburgh, where I run a large training centre.
Okay, thanks very much. So we appreciate that sometimes the inspection process can maybe feel a little bit daunting. If you're a new chief or principal, maybe feels like a little bit to take on. So we're just going to walk through in this video cast a few of the things that might help you kind of feel a bit more ready for this. So I guess a starting question for both Jane and Chris is, why does the RYA inspection process sit as it is? Because this might help us understand a little bit of some of the detail that goes into it. And yeah, Jane, do you want to kick us off around why the inspection process happens as it does?
So the inspection process probably started, I think it was around the late 1970s, and it's had to evolve to accommodate a number of different relationships as the years have gone by. One relationship that's pretty crucial is with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, and they actually work with the RYA to try to ensure that training centres don't have to comply with the various codes of practice that are out there concerning the delivery of activity on the water, which is why, for example, we have a 3-mile limit for a lot of training centres who don't have coded boats. But the RYA have worked to protect training centres from having to comply with coding. And then there's another relationship with the Adventure Activities Licensing Authority, which again is about making sure that training centres who only offer sailing, windsurfing, powerboating and winging type activities don't have to have an ALA license because they've got an RYA inspection process in play. And so there's a lot more, I suppose, questions around staff training and boat and maintenance management that have crept in over the years because of those external relationships and because we have such a strong policing. Policing's a really strong word, but it's, you know, we do an annual inspection and RYA instructors cannot offer RYA courses away from a centre except in specific circumstances. So it's a highly respected worldwide scheme, and that means that sometimes it comes with a bit of questioning and bureaucracy alongside it, neither of which should be seen as a threat.
Chris, have you got anything that you want to kind of add on top of that?
Yeah, further, moving on from what Jane was saying, it quite often is considered to be quite an onerous process, but in reality, it actually isn't. It's quite a good opportunity to sort of cover all the bits and pieces that are outstanding from the year. One of the things that Jane touched on was sort of external providers. I suppose moving on, it does evolve year on year, and in addition to sort of advice from external sort of partners, lessons that are learned in the industry also will influence the inspection process. And you might find that questions occur because there's been an incident, and some of those incidents are actually quite well publicized. Some of them are less so, but that's why the questions that you might come across during the inspection, they will vary from year to year. They do try and update the process to keep it as relevant as they possibly can.
Yeah, I think I've mainly experienced the inspection process so far as through roles that I've had as a chief instructor, and I think that element of, yeah, in one sense the word policing that Jane used, but actually if you flip that to kind of think of it as actually helping protect your centre, your staff, and just set kind of good things in practice. And there is those extra tiers that I think are sometimes not realised around the MCA and ELA and stuff like that, that the inspection process actually provides a lot of support and makes our life a lot easier on. Going down that route, other water sports maybe don't have such kind of similar practices in place. So for those centres that are maybe multi-activity, why and how do the other water sports maybe differ to our system? Because that might be quite a useful thing for some dentists to have an appreciation of. Maybe Jane, do you want to kick us off for that again?
Yeah. So suppose that there are accreditation schemes in paddle sports in some cases. So the British Canoeing Association, so they're not called that anymore, sorry, they're just called British Canoeing, have a kind of delivery accreditation scheme. But their scheme is very different to ours in that there's still no formal inspection per se. You sign up and you know, make sure that you have all the relevant paperwork in place, but nobody really comes to see what you're doing. In terms of the other bodies, such as kite surfing, perhaps stand-up paddleboarding bodies, again, accreditation may exist, but it's very specific to their qualification systems and not necessarily seen beyond the UK borders. So this is where we're different in that technically somebody who could start work at Port Edgar, for example, with Chris, could then go and work in China. If they speak Mandarin, they're able to go and work in China and work in a training center in China. So, you know, that in itself is a really important element not to forget. We're not just about the kind of local sailing club. The opportunities that RYA training and RYA inspections give are just so wide. There's so many opportunities there that can be taken. And it's also about making sure, the one thing we didn't touch on previously was the standard of delivery to the end user. It needs to be the same, and it needs to make sure that people get the same experience, whether they go to Port Edgar or whether they go to Aberdeenshire Sailing Trust or whether they go down to Calshot. It's the same across each of the RYA centres, which is why the system is the way it is. You know, it's to make sure that that's what's happening. So other water sports providers, just going back to that, can access the ALA, so that's Adventure Activities Licensing Authority accreditation, if they want to offer activities to other people. But because the RYA scheme is so strong, if you only offer sailing, powerboating, windsurfing and winging, then you don't have to have an ALA badge, or you don't need to go through the ALA process anyway.
I know, Chris, your centre has kind of paddle sports as well. So any extra reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've always found that the systems generally work quite hand in hand, and there are some very complementary aspects from both ALA inspections and the RYA inspections. To be honest, the RYA inspection probably is slightly less onerous in many senses, and it's a bit easier to manage. ALA is slightly more, well, in my experience, there's a bit more paperwork that has to be completed. The RYA is, tends to be a little bit more straightforward, both in terms of sort of preparation before and post inspection, but also the actual inspection itself. It tends to be relatively short, snappy, and to the point. But that's often because the sort of the activities that have been offered by the RYA training centres are usually we're not offering loads of different activities. That most organizations are offering dinghy sailing, and we're offering 2 or 3 levels of dinghy sailing, perhaps a bit of powerboating as well, whereas ALA tends to be, it might cover a multitude of activities. But to be honest, they do complement each other. So certainly I've found more and more that as paperwork that ALA have perhaps asked for a few years, that's now filtering down to the RYA system. So actually a lot of the documentation we need is the same. So it's not even duplication, it's more just you know, a mirroring of procedures that, you know, from one organization to the other. The SQA, again, I've sort of found there's slightly more yeah, as James mentioned, sort of slightly more hands off. It's more of a self-assessment, but there is support there if you need it. And the other organisations that you might come across, and there are a few much smaller, I suppose, governing bodies of stand-up paddleboarding, but they haven't got the same support. Most of it seems to be geared up around instructor training, and I suppose possibly therefore end user experience, whereas the RYA system is more robust in many areas. I think the point that came up earlier was that it's really about protecting the centre. So if we look past the sort of the actual, you know, onerous process of filling in forms and doing paperwork, what we're trying to do is make sure that the centre has everything they need before the start of the season to run effectively, and more importantly, that the people that come to enjoy courses at these centres have a great time, yeah, wherever you are in the UK, but again, wherever you are in the world, really.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the kind of equality of standards across all centres as well. So there's a real kind of good benchmark as to what people can expect when they see that it is kind of RYA recognised at that point. So I know you've experienced things both from the inspector and from the kind of centre principal end. Chris, do you want to kick us off around, okay, I've got my centre ready to go, season started. How does the inspection process work in Scotland for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally at the start of the year, probably about now, sort of April, May time, the RYA Scotland will issue all the inspections, and what will happen is that the inspector will get an email from RYA Scotland with a little bit of information about the centre, and at the same time, the centre will get an email notifying them who their inspector will be. There's a bit more information included on that, so things like previous action plans, if appropriate, might be included. And what will happen then is that the inspector and the centre will liaise. This doesn't necessarily happen straight away, as every this time of year, inspectors and centres are quite busy, so that process can take a few weeks. It's not up to the inspector to contact the centre. It's not necessarily up to the centre to contact the inspector. It's a two-way process. So all I would say is, you know, if you want to arrange an early inspection, if that suits your programs, then just drop the inspector an email, or give him or her a bell, and then we can, you know, that's usually the easiest way to schedule it in. So generally, inspections will it makes sense to try and do them as early as possible, really. Often that works for many clubs and many centres, because if there's anything that comes up during the inspection process, then that can be acted upon, and then it's sort of implemented for that season. If you have an inspection, and sometimes it has to happen, but if you have an inspection in October, well, everything that is discussed in October is quite often forgotten about by the start of the next year. So yeah, we have a conversation with an inspector and the centre. They'll get a date sorted, and then it varies from inspector to inspector as to what happens then. So what seems to be the case now, and this was started to happen during the pandemic, but actually seems to have stuck, and in my opinion is a really good way of making the time that is spent with the inspector on site much more effective. And this is that the inspectors often ask for paperwork in advance now. So for example, if I'm doing inspection, I might ask to see all the relevant paperwork sent over by PDF, operating procedures. We might ask for a completed IR1 form. So if we can get all of that in advance, it means that the inspector's got time to go through the paperwork, perhaps highlight any areas they'd like to seek clarification on. And often it means that, again, before the inspection, these questions can be dealt with, and then the centre can update that bit of paperwork, and then again we can deal with other aspects, practical aspects on the day. So some inspectors like to see paperwork in advance. Sometimes that's not practical for various reasons. So the inspector will ask the centre to get a sort of a list of all their paperwork. I'll send over a list of paperwork and ask the centre to prepare that for the inspection day. And so that's how that's generally how the process works up until when the inspector enters the site.
Jane, have you got anything that you want to add around that kind of process leading up to the inspection, who your inspector might be, and what Chris was mentioning around the kind of forms and how that might help both the inspector and the centre?
I think the only thing I would say to them, in addition to what Chris has said, is just to make sure that when they get the letter from RYA Scotland telling them who their inspector is, that they check to make sure that the right levels of recognition are on that letter. We have to check too, because sometimes there's a mistake. It's not anyone's fault, it's just the way it goes. So just make sure that you are going to be inspected for the things that you want. And if there's something not there, then just a gentle reminder that you do need to apply for recognition before the inspector turns up. So you do need to fill out a form. We can't just add it to the inspection action plan, for example. We actually need to now have a trail of evidence to show that the centre has actually wanted to increase its recognition, or change the centre principal, or change the chief instructor. So all of those things now require a form to fill out, I'm afraid. And the inspector can help with that. So if you go back to your inspector and just say, actually, that's not quite right, and this is what we need to change, they can send you through the form, or they can patch you into the RYA training support site so you can find the form if you need it. Apart from that, like Chris, I tend to want as much information before I come as possible, so that I can make my inspection more meaningful to the people I'm coming to see. So I can prep some questions, or I can prep some added value information to make the process a little bit more useful for the centre that I'm coming to visit. But as Chris says, that's just me and the way I do it. He does it the way he does it. So there are some slight differences, but the main principal part is that IR1 form. And make sure you've gone through the final page of the IR1 form. So you've got to fill out, as the centre principal or chief instructor, you've got to fill out the first 2 pages, which is about your instructors and your kit. But the last page is for the inspector to follow. But you should read that to make sure you know what sorts of questions we're going to ask. That's probably my kind of take on it.
Yeah, and I guess staying with you, Jane, flipping that on its head, what's the process in terms of other opportunities for the training centre to ask the inspector questions, and how does that kind of interaction work, and what do you see the inspector's role as through all this?
So we kind of play 2 roles. One is that we're coming in to make sure that a centre is compliant. And I use the word centre even though I'm talking to a club, because a club that holds RYA recognition is still an RYA training centre. So they're still a centre even though they see themselves as a club. So we come in to make sure that you're compliant with the needs of the RYA recognition. Can't get my words out this morning. And then the other thing is to make sure that you are up to speed on any changes or developments or new ideas that are coming out, or sharing of best practice that as an inspector we see happening elsewhere. So questions can be, ideally questions are prepared before we come, and in a lovely ideal world we get them by email before we come, so that we come with the information that's needed. But you can also ask questions when we're there. Please do, because that's the best part of the inspection, really, is that opportunity to have a conversation about what's going on and what sorts of things you're planning to do and where you want to go with the activities you're delivering. But also afterwards, if something crops up after the inspection that rats, I forgot to ask that, then just drop an email or give your inspector a call and ask the question, because they're very often, if they don't know the answer, we're all pretty well connected. We can find somebody who can tell us stuff. Chris, I have something for you later about aluminium hulled ribs, for example. These are the sorts of things that we may not know directly because we don't have experience of it, but we know each other, so we can always reach out to another inspector and ask.
Yeah, I think that is a really good thing around kind of the inspector network in Scotland, is everybody's got slightly different strengths in slightly different disciplines, and so that is kind of utilised through the team, as Jane's describing, which is, yeah, good to see. So I guess probably something else to consider for centres, what should they have prepared beforehand? We've alluded a little bit to some of the stuff that might be useful, but should we try and do a wee kind of summary of what do they need to have done before the inspector arrives on the doorstep? Do you want to maybe kick us off with that, Chris?
Yeah, so the quite often, and I understand why, but quite often this is perceived to be a massive deal, and everything has to be totally immaculate, and everything has to be in its proper place. And I suppose from my point of view, and feel free to jump in, Jane, with your view, but I feel that actually, as an inspector, I would much prefer to see a centre working, see a centre how it actually is. That gives me a far better understanding of how an organisation is going to operate than seeing everything in its perfect place, perfectly labelled. In reality, that might be the case for the inspection, but then post-inspection and pre-inspection, that it probably isn't a reflection on normality. So I would, and I'd also like to sort of hope that most of the recognised training centres that operate in well, hopefully every RYA training centre, wherever they're based, even on a sort of a non-inspection day, I'd like to think that the kit is in pretty good condition. I'd like to think that it's there aren't major problems with paperwork. It doesn't have to just be perfect for the inspection day. So back to your question, Robyn, what I would like to see is the centre in good working order, as it should be all the time. It would be good to have a good sample of equipment. So what I mean by that is we don't necessarily have to go through every single sailing dinghy that they have on site, but we do have to see a selection. And the way the inspectors do that is they often sort of dip test. So if there's 20 picos with covers on, we'll probably look at two or three of those. We won't take off 20 covers during the inspection process. Equally, if your centre is recognised for things like I don't know, sailing with spinnakers, for example, then we'll probably need to look at a pico and a boat that has a more high performance vessel as well. So we won't have to look at everything, but we'll have to have a look at some of the kits. So make sure that, if you are reliant on a certain, like for example, a catamaran to deliver multi-hull courses, well, let's make sure the cat is there, and let's make sure the inspector can have a look at it. Same thing with powerboat fleets. Again, powerboats, they tend to go through a little bit more detail, and we would like to see all that sort of, we'll have to go through equipment that's on board. So it would make sense to look at things like flare expiry dates in advance of the inspection and make sure that they're in date, because if they're not, then and the inspector picks up on that, which I hope they will, then that will have to go down as an action plan, because those flares aren't suited for purpose. So in terms of equipment, just have a good look at what you've got and make sure that it's all okay, it's all suited for purpose. It doesn't have to be totally immaculate, it just has to be suited for purpose, as I expect it would be during the season. In terms of paperwork, generally, it depends how much the inspector wants to see in advance. Like it kind of makes sense to package it all up and send all of it, and the inspector is quite happy usually to pick through it. And definitely a set of standard operating procedures that are suitable for the operation the centre runs. And if, for example, you have a set of standard operating procedures that don't include an aspect of training you delivered, the inspector will pick up on that. So if you are recognised once again for I don't know, day sailing or something else, advanced powerboat, your operating procedures, they need to reflect every aspect of delivery. We'll have to see things like instructor qualifications. Now, again, if you've got a club that relies on 30 instructors in different forms, and some teach quite a lot over the course of the season, some teach once or twice, you don't have to put necessarily all 30 on the form. It's more to make sure that there's a good representation of instructor to course. So, for example, once again, if you have an SI that is on the paperwork that is crucial for your operation, let's put them down on the paperwork. If you've then got 30 digging instructors, just pick 2 or 3 of your key staff and add them. So the biggest thing that comes up probably is things like first aid certificates. Most of the time, the candidates, the staff do have them, but if the centre can spend a little bit of time just sort of collating those, that's something that's definitely worth spending some time on. Every centre will have their own method of keeping track of those, and the inspector doesn't have to see all these in advance, but it's something to think about. It's worth making sure that there's things like up-to-date emergency action plans and procedures. Make sure that there's a decent health and safety policy, and it reflects what's being delivered, because things do change. A lot of health and safety policies were updated again after the pandemic. There was a lot of sort of reflection on operation, and that seems to have been a big thing that's changed. Records of staff training. Again, everyone does staff training. We all know that, but we have to document that for a number of reasons, which we might come on to later on. So all these bits of paperwork, all of which are outlined in the IR1 form on the last page, just have a quick flick through that. Get everything, perhaps update it, check it's all suited for purpose, equipment and paperwork, and then the staff qualification aspect of it, and that will set you in really good stead for the day itself.
Fair amount there. I'm sure, Jane, have you got anything you want to kind of dip in with, comment on, add to?
Yeah, so like Chris, I would like to see a working centre. I get my kind of prickles on the back of my neck come up when I arrive and I find ropes are coiled and everything's in neat lines, but not necessarily, I suppose, look like they're being used. So at the start of the season, you might expect that to be the case, but by the time you get to the middle of the season, you know the boats are being used. You know that things are not always going to be put away in lines and tidy and everything. So yeah, so I think just don't put on a special effort for us. Just be, and let us see what you actually do, because that gives us a much better feeling for what's going on and how we can be more supportive to you. And then I think I come back to my comment about the last page of the IR1 form. Go through it and make sure you have everything that's on that list there. So I think we're almost going into more of the kind of what might trip centres up, but each one of those questions is as much for you as it is for us. They're a guide to say, what sorts of things do you need to have? And it's I suppose if you want to call it that, it could be seen as a bit of a shortcut through the guidance notes for inspections. Because technically, as chief instructors and principals, you should have read the guidance notes for inspection, so you know what you have to comply with. But we understand they're not that, how should we say it, engaging. So actually using the checklist at the back is a really good way of just saying, okay, do we have all of these things? And if you don't know what something is, then reach out to your inspector beforehand. So for example, if you don't understand what they mean by kind of ongoing observation and recording those observations, then get in touch with your inspector and just say, I'm not sure what that means. I think we do it, but I'm not quite sure. So could you just explain that to us? So that you're ready for the inspection. Because I think what we all want is, inspectors and centres alike, is to walk away with nothing on the action plan at the end. You want to be able to say, this centre is rocking it. These guys are awesome. That's what we all want.
So I guess with that aim in mind, and you alluded to it briefly, what are the kind of common things that you've both seen around your inspections that have maybe challenged, or as you said, Jane, kind of slightly tripped up centres? Are there kind of a few kind of things that are reoccurring at the moment? Chris, have you got any?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one that it comes across, and I suppose the thing that is sort of out of the centre's control is keeping staff qualifications up to date. That comes up every single year. Usually there's a case of, on the day of inspection, quite regularly I have people phoning, I have centres, I'm doing the inspection, I have chief instructors phoning staff and getting up to date first aid certificates. So that if we can do that in advance, it just saves time and keeps the process smooth. So definitely proper, some kind of method of keeping on top of staff qualifications. More recently, things like if you have a centre that uses other vessels, make sure there's a proper contract of hire or a lease agreement in place, because the RYA and the MC want to know that the vessel, that who's actually in charge of the vessel. So if something happens, then who actually has responsibility for that. As an inspector, we're not fussed about how detailed that is, or even, you know, again, the finance agreements between the two parties is none of our concern, but we do need to see some kind of lease agreement or contract of hire. I think another thing that's come up recently quite regularly is the things like a record of staff training and a record of induction. So we've had a requirement to have staff sign something to say that they've read and understood the standard operating procedures for a long time. But more recently, if we're delivering training to our staff at the start of the season, or perhaps you have I don't know, once a week or once a month, you have a training evening for your staff, just make a little note of that, make a record of that. And that means that you can sort of you can demonstrate that training is constantly happening, and you can prove that this is what's been trained and this date and who delivered it, and that sort of thing. So that comes up, those sort of things come up pretty regularly. And I think Jane maybe touched this earlier, one of us touched on it earlier on, that make sure that the paperwork you have does actually reflect what you're delivering, which might seem like a really simple thing, but if the paperwork's out of date, it's not worth having it in the folder. So update it, and that could be as simple as removing sections that aren't relevant anymore. Or it might be, you know, adding in a little bit to, if you've expanded on your activities, maybe adding in a bit. For me, those are the things that probably crop up fairly regularly. I don't know if there's anything else, Jane, that springs to mind.
So recently for me in inspections, like Chris said, the staff training is the big one. So every year, theoretically, you should be looking at some form of induction training for your team, even though you might be running a club and you see the same volunteers year after year. They still need to be reminded of the risk assessments and standard operating procedures, and any changes that you might have made over the winter to those documents need to be run through, and that type of induction training needs to be recorded. Likewise, if you have a new volunteer or a new staff member, make sure you've captured the induction training there. And then any ongoing training that you do with your team, and there is a pretty heavy reliance on that now, not reliance, but expectation from the RYA that there will be much more staff training happening. Anything you do, record it. So even if it's just a night where you go out blasting with spinnakers, record it. As a chief instructor or a principal, we're looking for you guys to start walking the floor. By that, we mean that you're going to go and take a look at what people are doing and making sure that they're compliant with your safety management protocols, but they're also delivering high quality sessions. And again, those need to be recorded. And you can do that in any way that suits you. We're not saying it has to be a specific form or any other kind of way. I've seen people do it in diaries. I've seen people do it on their phone. I've seen people capture documents in Google Drive. Whatever works for you, as long as you have a record. That's the kind of main thing. I think tripping up on the standard operating procedures. So very often you'll see risk assessments have been changed, but they don't necessarily they're not then reflected in the operating procedures. So make sure that the two are very much connected. And I think probably the last thing I would suggest, two last things. One is emergency action plans, making sure that the action plan actually does reflect what you do, and run training in it. Because I think a lot of the time people turn into frightened rabbits in headlights, and they get a bit stuck when something bad happens and they don't know what to do. Have a little card, produce a wee card that you can pop into your buoyancy aid. And then I suppose the final thing is the safety briefing checklist, which again seems to be the thing that's tripping a few centres up, and has been for probably the last 18 months or so, that I think a lot of people think that their staff will give a little briefing, and they do. Most people give a safety briefing of some kind before they head out on the water. But actually what we're looking for now is it to be documented. So there's a clear, this is what you're going to say, document as part of any safety briefing before you hit the water. So those would be the main sort of things. But I guess just do the best you can to be as ready as possible for the inspection, so that, as Chris articulated so well, those phone calls, the chasing around trying to find things, get the kit that you use, get it on site. It doesn't help us at all if you don't have it there. We need to see it. So yeah, just get everything as ready as you possibly can before we come.
Yeah. And I think just kind of following on from that point of stuff being on site, I think we've touched briefly on kind of it's good to see the centre in kind of working order when stuff's happening. Trying to liaise with your inspectors as early as possible, I guess, to get a date that works for both the inspector and yourself to try and ensure that that's able to happen is probably quite key. Do you say?
Definitely.
Yeah, it's something that we try and see centres that are actually delivering, and that's a great opportunity for an inspector to come in and do an inspection when there's activity on the water. However, it's not always possible, and although we will do our best to try and get dates that suit, in some circumstances it doesn't work. Can I just go back to a point, and this might be self-explanatory, but on the IR1 form, again, as we've been talking about, these are the things that seem to consistently trip centres up and fairly regularly reoccur with inspections. But as Jane mentioned earlier, the IR1 form, the last page, which has got all these things itemized, which is effectively the prompt that the inspector will ask you about, the section on safety briefing checklist, for example. But if you look at the IR1 form, it says B6 on the left-hand side as a column. That is that relates to the recognition notes, the RGN. So if there's a sentence on the IR1 form that you don't understand, just look to the left, and that letter and that number will relate to the full information that will explain it on the RYA training recognition guidance notes. There might be self-explanatory, but I think a lot of people perhaps that's bypassed them. You don't necessarily have to go through the entire, though we should be very much aware of them, but it's quite a full-on document. But this might sort of signpost us to certain bits of information that might solve an issue before the inspector gets on site.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really helpful nugget there. I think just going through some of these things, being aware of what's on that IR1 form before your inspector's on site sounds like a kind of pretty key piece of advice there. Have either of the two of you, before we start to close up, got any further kind of gems of advice for our centres? Jane, anything extra from yourself?
I think so. Probably just, if you don't know about something, just please ask. That's what we're here for. We're here to support, and it not just around the inspection process itself, but other things that might be going on in the world around good practice. It's amazing the sorts of questions you get asked when you get to the inspection, from buoyancy aids and maintenance, and to what the best grip is to put on top of a windsurfing board, and just having that kind of information to hand when you arrive would be really good. So rather than having to go away and go, I don't know anything about this, I need to go and read up on it. So yeah, just get in touch and ask so that we can give best value while we're there.
And Chris, yourself?
I absolutely agree. I think that Scotland in particular, we've got centres that are quite a long way from anywhere else, and often the only time that the centre is able to touch base with the RYA and potentially the sort of the sailing and community is through the inspection process. So do use your inspector if you've got questions that, again, questions that quite often come up, but don't specifically relate to the paperwork. Things like, social media. How do we govern social media? How do we market ourselves better? Or how do we retain staff when I'm on an island and instructors sort of keeping people engaged is difficult. So the inspector might not have the answer, but you can certainly ask, and the inspector will then be able to signpost you to either individuals who might be able to help, or perhaps to documentation, because everyone is going through the same challenges wherever you are. So yeah, you definitely ask questions, use your inspector as much as you possibly can, even if it's not specifically itemized on the bit of paper that we're filling out. That's their job, and they'll be really happy to help. And everyone's got a wealth of experience, which they'll be happy to share.
Yeah, definitely. So hopefully there's been some kind of useful stuff for training centres in preparation for this year's inspections through the discussion that we've had, from kind of why the process is as it is, to kind of how to prepare and things to watch out for. If you have any questions, queries following this kind of video cast, then please do get in touch, either with your inspector, who you should have an awareness of now. The emails will have gone out to inspectors and centres now, or to RYA Scotland, so it's coaching@ryscotland.org.uk, very easy email address, so please feel free to reach out, and I'll echo what Jane and Chris have been saying, and to ask, because that's what we're here for, and we'd like to help. So I think just leaves me to say, Chris and Jane, thank you very much for your time on this sunny morning. I know we'd probably all rather be out on the water, but hopefully that's been valuable, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, bye.